F1 is having a ruthless driver clear-out. We've gone from, well, unprecedented levels of stability coming into 2024 in terms of the driver lineup to a massive overhaul, basically half the grid changing ahead of 2025. If we look at the list, we've got Ricciardo out mid-season, Sargent out mid-season, Kevin Magnussen's out at the end of the year, Guan Yu Zhou's out at the end of the year, Sergio Perez clinging on by his fingernails, probably out at the end of the year too. And 3 total rookies coming in for 2025 alongside some new faces that have become a little bit familiar during the course of 2024. Scott, what is behind this massive overhaul of the F1 grid?
Yeah, it's a little bit linked to the fact that we had that stability for the start of 2024, because things can come in cycles, especially when driver contracts are aligned or contract durations are aligned. So you had a lot of drivers that went into 2024 still in the same place, but ultimately in the final year of their contract, or in the case of Lewis Hamilton at Mercedes, in the first year of a 2-year contract with a break clause in the middle of it. So you have a little bit of that, which means that there's possibility there for drivers to leave and go somewhere else, or teams to have an opportunity to make a change. That's significant. Then you've also got this fact of pressure from below, with at least 2 drivers in Bearman and Antonelli making really strong cases internally at their respective backers to get an F1 seat sooner rather than later, plus a couple of other drivers who have broken through. We're going with Jack Doohan, Franco Colapinto, Gabriel Bortoleto will be Audi's representative at Sauber next year. They come into the picture as the year goes on, and just some good old-fashioned unexpected curveballs like Hamilton's move to Ferrari, which nobody sees coming, and then has a big knock-on effect because it immediately puts one driver out of work in Carlos Sainz, and it has this ripple through the grid where places become available or not available. So yeah, a massive storm of factors coming together for what has been a crazy driver market, and sets us up for a really intriguing 2025 with so many new faces in new places.
Yeah, there's been a real contrast established with certain teams like Ferrari as a destination for Hamilton, and Aston with Alonso retaining quite old drivers into their 40s, admittedly multiple world champions, but nevertheless old drivers. And then this massive push for youth at the other end of the grid. And we spend so long in periods of F1 thinking, oh, this guy's clogging up a seat. F1 teams are inherently conservative. They like to go for experience usually. But suddenly there's this massive push for youth. So why suddenly a renewed faith in the younger drivers?
Yeah, it is interesting. If you look at a couple of teams specifically, there is actually quite a good lineage over the last 10 years or so of giving youth a chance. You look at McLaren, for example, with Kevin Magnussen, then Stoffel Van Dorn, then Lando Norris, and then Oscar Piastri. Actually, they've been quite good at just taking a punt on a really highly rated young driver, one of their own drivers, or in the case of Piastri, someone else's young driver that they're not quite taking seriously enough. So it has existed. Ferrari, for example, didn't put Charles Leclerc straight in to the main team, but only did 1 year at Sauber before they gave him that chance. So there has been a little bit of a trend, and I think part of that is because young drivers are more prepared and more talented than they've ever been, and that is something that you trend towards. I think in general that happens across all sports. It'll inevitably happen as drivers get more prepared, get more opportunities. Some of these young drivers, honestly, even in Formula 3, they're doing a lot of simulator work for these F1 teams. So teams are getting an eye on them a lot sooner. I think that is probably a factor. When you've also got doubt about older drivers, and as you say, there's always this kind of changing of the guard that happens when teams try to work out, right, when does the clear out need to take place? And sometimes that's just on the horizon, like Hamilton with Mercedes, or Red Bull find themselves in a situation where the temporary solution, Sergio Perez, has ended up more of a permanent solution than they ever intended. And then your Bottas's, Ricciardo's, Magnussen's, etc., different levels of performance within them, but all broadly in the same boat. And that's when you have to weigh up, right, are our young drivers ready? And is it now going to be less of a risk to put them in place of the older experienced head?
Yeah, it's a good point about the fact that there's this cyclical thing happening all the time. It's just rare that it all happens at the same time for multiple teams. I think in this specific case, you've got a couple of guys who have been banging on the door behind the scenes, Antonelli and Bearman. To me, it feels like there's been a kind of domino effect where, because Antonelli's kind of a separate case, I think it's almost unique in terms of what's going on at Mercedes, but Bearman has had these kind of unexpected auditions at Ferrari and then Haas, and he's done so well, which Ferrari probably expected, but nevertheless it's shown everyone in F1 and the world that he can do it. And it seems to have created a domino effect for me, where other teams have then gone, well, if this guy who's having a really, I'd say, below average season in F2 can turn up in F1 and look stunning, well, maybe we should be looking at our guys or the guys who are coming up in other teams' junior academies and taking a punt on them. Because if there's a young guy who you've got faith in, it's a no-brainer to put them in over the old experienced guy who's coming to the end of their career. You just don't know if the young guy can cut it until they're given a chance. And I feel like Bearman's given everybody a frame of reference that they probably didn't expect.
It's fascinating because often it would be that a driver that had stellar results in their junior career could get to F2, GP2, whatever it was called. And if they didn't stun straight away, that could kill their momentum. And we've seen in the last few years, drivers have won F2 and struggled to get into Formula One. It's put such a premium on the work that they do in Formula One because you said it earlier, Ben, teams are so inherently conservative. They really need to know that they're not really gambling on their young driver. And Bearman coming in, I mean, Bearman's had a prolific reserve season, not necessarily just because of his performances, but just the sheer quantity of chances. He had 3 full Grand Prix weekends, including a sprint race, which is way more than he could have possibly hoped for. So Bearman coming in and also not just stepping in at Haas and doing it where people might just go, oh yeah, but it's Hulkenberg. Oh yeah, but it's Hulkenberg in Baku and he doesn't really like Baku or anything. No disrespect to Nico, he's had a great season, but you put Bearman in a Ferrari at the last minute on a track like Jeddah, and yeah, it doesn't make Q3, but gets into the points and runs strongly in the points. You know, if Ferrari somehow pull it out the bag and come back at McLaren at the end of the season, who knows if that handful of points that Bearman scored in Saudi could be critical to Ferrari winning a championship. That sort of thing is just proof that these drivers actually can. They're so well prepared, they've got so much ability, they've got such the right attitude, such capability. It isn't actually a risk to put them in. And I think you're right, there is then a knock-on effect. You might as well, you put so much investment in these drivers with F2 programs or F1 test outings, simulator work, etc. At some point, you want a return on that investment. So you see Bearman doing very well. Mercedes is super convinced by Antonelli, who's had a tricky rookie season in Formula 2, decent, but it's been a bit all over the place. It just takes away those question marks that do exist around Formula 2 about the equality of the machinery, the reliability of the machinery, the format not being great. What matters is what these people do in Formula 1 cars. If they've got attributes that come to the fore in Formula 1 or are punished a little bit more in Formula 1. And then you see more drivers come in and do it. Colapinto, for example, I'm not surprised we're seeing drivers actually punted on because they're not really punts in the way that they would have been in the past.
Yeah, and Mercedes clearly doesn't think Antonelli's a punt. Okay, it looks like it when he crashes on his second lap of FP1 in Monza, but obviously he was doing a lot of work in an old testing program car earlier in the year and looking, as we understand it, very impressive. And there was a kind of inevitability about Mercedes promoting him anyway. They felt such faith in his inherent ability. They were kind of looking for the moment at which they needed to make the biggest call they would have made in the last few years. And that concerns Lewis Hamilton. I think we should stop for a second and talk about him because there have been some revelations recently in a sort of tell-all behind-the-scenes book charting 2023 and 2024. And Toto Wolff has basically been saying that although Hamilton pulled the trigger and jumped to Ferrari before his latest contract with Mercedes began, they were weighing up, this kind of inevitable moment of decline, when it would come. Is he over the hill? When are we going to have to tell the greatest driver in terms of results in F1 history when to stop with us? And he's kind of made that call for them and allowed them to promote Antonelli. Set against the backdrop of a terrible season for Hamilton too, is this kind of the beginning of the end for Hamilton? And were Mercedes kind of right to be thinking this way even before Hamilton made his move to Ferrari?
Well, Mercedes was right to be thinking this way because, as I said before, there's always a changing of the guard. There's always a point where you have to work out an awkward transition period between a driver not being the absolute nailed-on 100% performer that they were before, and maybe you've got a younger driver that could step in and do almost as good a job. And that's the point. I don't think they need to step in straight away and be an upgrade. It's just at what point is the cost at the lowest? If they step in and do a better job immediately, then that's basically a bonus. But you're looking for the most painless transition possible. And I don't think it's ridiculous to suggest that Hamilton is past his peak, partly because the peak was so incredibly high. You can still be past that peak and still be one of the best driver on the grid, maybe the best driver on the grid. If everybody was in equal machinery, we'd have a clear answer, wouldn't we? But I think there are too many variables in this season to be 100% sure where Hamilton's ability still is, because there are clearly still problems within Mercedes with that car. It's probably the hardest car on the grid in terms of its unpredictability to actually judge what the drivers are doing, because Hamilton and Russell are too good between them to be making the number of errors that they've made and have the weird kind of inconsistency in qualifying. There is a specific issue qualifying wise on Hamilton's side, but again, how much of that is exacerbated by the car? How much of it is an actual incompatibility with these cars, these rules, these tyres, whatever, that may or may not replicate again when he moves at Ferrari, or might be solved when he gets into another car? And how much of it is also Lewis checking out a little bit because Mercedes haven't got it together, because he's in his final year, because he's got an eye on 2025? Like, it's not a free pass by any means, but it's just hard to get that firm answer. But you're right, and what Wolff has said in his book is kind of blunt, but it does get to the crux of the matter. Sooner or later, they were going to have to move towards Antonelli. That was the way that they wanted to go. And this has kind of made it easy for them because Lewis is the one that's made the decision. And that is broadly what happens with the very, very best drivers. They do either go somewhere else or they retire. Lewis isn't ready to do the latter, and I think he needed a new opportunity to stoke that fire within him and see if he's still got it to absolutely push it to 100%, because he's been doing this for a very long time. No one would blame him if he wanted to take a break. But it has made that transition easier for Mercedes to manage in a way.
Yeah, and I think also the George Russell element can't be underestimated, because there's been a pattern, even during these chaotic ground effect seasons of Mercedes, of Russell being kind of quicker, or at least as quick as Hamilton over a single lap. The qualifying pattern is more established as the years have gone on. And that has to be a trigger point for Mercedes going, well, okay, Lewis has achieved so much, but is he actually a step above anyone we can put in the second car? He has been for so long, but in the case of Russell, it's not so clear cut, and then it's not too much of a leap from that point to start thinking about the next step, the future, or offering shorter contracts, etc. Which, you know, in other sports is quite common, isn't it? If you're a footballer and you go past 30, maybe it's 35 now because sports science and fitness are better, you can't expect to be having long-term contracts unless someone's absolutely desperate to get you in. So there's a kind of inevitable feeling to all of this with Lewis, I think. Going back to the guys at the top of the show that we talked about getting ousted, are there any that you feel sympathy for here, or are these all guys that, you know, you think inevitably it was their time to go?
Yeah, I think when we were putting this together and sort of making the notes, the sort of phrases of F1 natural selection and the law of the jungle cropped up, and that is absolutely the case. I mean, of the drivers who have either dropped off the grid already this year or are going to at the end of the season, I think Bottas, and to a degree someone like Ricciardo, like, I have sympathy for. Bottas, I just always have sympathy for a driver who still seems to be performing well but has an absolute shed of a car to be working
and
on.
has his own sympathy corner in our podcast.
Yes, in our podcast, yeah. But Valtteri does not deserve to be 23rd in a 20-driver championship. That is evident off this season. So I do have some sympathy for him. Where I don't have sympathy is he's had a very good Grand Prix career. He's won multiple races. He's had chances to win world championships in the quality of machinery and team that he had when he was alongside Hamilton. So it's hard to have too much sympathy there. And then the rest, it's all an element of, well, do a better job and you would have stuck around. You know, Magnussen's been dropped by Haas. It's the fourth time he's been dropped, basically, or lost his seat, however you want to phrase it. And there's a reason that keeps happening. Sargent hasn't seen out the season for the same reason. Zhou Guanyu's had 3 years at Sauber and hasn't proven that he deserves more than that. Ricciardo was fine, but no more than fine, and Red Bull needed more than fine because he was meant to be a backup to Perez, who was meant to be a temporary solution in the first place, and that just hasn't worked. So it's the same with Perez at Red Bull, right? Like, you can't have too much sympathy with someone who has stuck around for a really long time, got a great opportunity, and ultimately just hasn't made the most of it. It is, in that situation, time, especially when you don't have the weight of career success on your side to earn your second chance or your reprieve. It's one of the reasons why people have probably been a bit kind to Hamilton in this season, because he's got the weight of his entire career proving that actually this at the moment can be treated as the anomaly. And it's not a guarantee that he's passed it or washed or whatever because of all that came before it. These drivers don't have that same body of work in their favour.